Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to see you all here tonight. What's going to happen is that, as you've just heard, I'm going to talk to you a bit about faith in politics. I will then take questions on almost anything. Now, I used to say to audiences up and down the country, you can ask me questions on anything you like. And then, I suppose about 6 or more years ago, I got for the first time in my entire career a question I couldn't answer. Now, normally, if you don't know the answer to a question, which does indeed happen quite often, it's very simple. You do one of two things. You either waffle, but with the most tremendous authority, or you say to the person who's asked the question, you say, just let me go to what lies underneath your concerns. And then you answer the question they didn't quite ask you. But on this occasion, I couldn't even resort to either of those two manoeuvres. And I just stood there gaping like a goldfish and thinking, what on earth am I going to say? And it wasn't even a political event, it was a charity lunch. And a lady stood up and with a completely straight face, she said to me, could you explain to us here this afternoon why anybody would want to have an affair with John Prescott? Do you know, I still don't know the answer to that. But you can ask me anything else. We're going to ask that the first 3 or 4 questions do be on the subject of the lecture, so that those who've come to address themselves specifically to that will have the first chance. But then after that, we will open it up. You can ask about any aspect of the current political situation. You can ask about any of those excellent books which will be on sale immediately afterwards. You can ask about any of the television work I've done, including Strictly Come Dancing, if you must. You can even ask, do blondes have more fun? The answer is I'm not entirely certain, but there was one thing that I did notice. While I was blonde, quite suddenly, men began to talk to me much more slowly. So do feel that you can ask anything. It can be serious, it can be frivolous, it can be all points in between. We would just ask that the first 3 or 4 questions are directed to the subject of the lecture. And really the way that I want to go about addressing this is by answering some of the questions that are most often put to me about faith and politics. Now, I shall be talking very largely this evening from my own perspective of faith and politics, which is, of course, the Christian faith. But most of the comments that I am making would apply equally to anybody of any faith. Because we live in an age in which religion is now treated rather suspiciously. And yet it is vital, it does drive, and it does motivate a lot of people. So I think we need to look at some of those questions which so often come my way. And the first is, how can you be a Christian and a politician? Now, I always say, look, it's vital. If you want Christians in government, they've got to be politicians. If you want completely godless government, don't have anybody of any faith in government. But otherwise, if you do want any influence of faith on the way that the country is run, then it is important that people of faith do engage in politics. And yet, it's not quite such a daft question as it sounds. Because Christianity is, by and large, based upon absolutes. That is true, that is false. That is right, that is wrong. Love the sinner, hate the sin. Politics, by contrast, is based on the art of the possible, which is another way of saying that it is based on compromise. And anybody who goes into politics with the view that they will never, ever compromise on anything at all ain't going to get anything done. And let me illustrate that by taking a very early example that I met with when I went into the House of Commons. Now, I got in 1987. And in that year, David Alton, who was then a Lib Dem MP for a Liverpool seat, came up in the private members' ballot very high and introduced a bill to limit abortions to the 18th week or below of gestation and to ban all abortion after the 18th week. Now, it does not take a genius to work out that that bill was itself a compromise. David Alton does not believe in abortion at 18 weeks, or at 16 weeks, or at 14 weeks, or at any number of weeks you care to list. And nor did the overwhelming number of people who either sponsored or supported that bill. If they could have had free choice as to what they wanted to do, pretty well all of them would have said, we want to repeal the 1967 Act, lock, stock and barrel. If David Alton had decided that was what he was going to do, he wouldn't have got past first reading. There would have been no vote for the bill to continue at the end of second reading. It simply wouldn't have happened. So he had a choice. Did he, given that he was so high up in the ballot, make a stand, introduce a bill that he knew wasn't even going to get a second reading, but nevertheless make a lot of noise about it and about his objections? Or did he say, okay, I can't get what I want and would like to see, but I can save some unborn life. And therefore I will introduce a bill which maximises the amount of unborn life that I think I can save. And realistically, we all thought that we might get 20 weeks. We did not expect to get 18 weeks, but it was worth trying. It was within the ballgame. Whereas if we'd gone for no weeks at all, we wouldn't, as I say, have got anywhere. So that was a compromise. And it's a bit like this. If you want to go to the North Pole, you must take 1 foot outside your front door. Taking that 1 foot outside your front door does not guarantee that you get to the North Pole, or even that you get halfway to the North Pole. But not taking that step absolutely and utterly guarantees that you don't get to the North Pole. And therefore, if you have an aim that you want to reach, very often in political life, you have to get there incrementally. And you have to compromise. And you have to say, it's no good going the whole hog. I'm going to go for something that takes me towards my goal. And I always judge a compromise in politics by, does it take you forward or does it leave you where you are, or God forbid, does it take you backwards? Now, if it does the second or the third, it's not worth having. But if there is a chance that it will take you a little bit further forward, it's worth doing. But there was an even bigger example of compromise awaiting those of us who were sponsoring that bill in 1987. And that was this. It became very clear in the course of the second reading debate that quite a significant number of members of Parliament were prepared to lend us their vote and to give us a second reading on the strict understanding that we introduced an exemption to the bill for handicapped unborn children. And if we did not do that, they would not support us at the later stages of the bill. And there was the most almighty division in the pro-life movement in Parliament as to what we did. Now, As far as we were concerned, an unborn handicapped child has exactly the same rights as an unborn fit and healthy child. But we looked at the statistics. And the statistics showed that 92% of all abortions after the 18th week were not carried out for handicap. 8% were. Now, there were some who said it doesn't matter. It's a concession too far. We don't do it. We lose the bill. We watch it go down. And there were others, including myself, who said, hang on. If you were faced with a shipwreck, and you knew there were 100 people on board, and you knew you could only get 92 off, would you get the 92 off, or would you see the whole ship go down and just stand on the shore? And in the end, that was the view that prevailed. Didn't make us happy. Didn't certainly make us happy when we had to face the disabled organisations and tell them what we were doing. But it maximised the chance of a bill. Now, if you only deal in absolutes, you can't get anywhere. And most faiths are based on absolutes. That this is wrong. And that if you accept even a part of that, you are doing something that is wrong. And so it is a sensible question to say, can you be a Christian and a politician? And my answer to that is yes, you can. Providing you're trying to maximise the amount of good you can do and are practical enough to accept that you cannot always do what you would like to do. Then people say to me, oh, fine, there's all you Christians sitting there in Parliament, and you're so rude to one another. You're always disagreeing. I say, yeah, it's part of the divine plan. Because if you want to have Christians in Parliament, and if you want to have Christians in government, then because in a democracy government changes hands, you need Christians in all mainstream parties. Now, you cannot be a Christian and a fascist, and you cannot be a Christian and a communist, but you can be a Christian and pretty well all points in between. And so you should. And that way, no one party can claim a virtue of Christian monopoly, and nor should it, ever. And I never want to see the day come when one party says we're Christian and that lot over there are not. And so it is important to have Christians in all parties. However, there was quite a serious movement at one point to see not if we could form a separate Christian party, which I wouldn't want to do for the reasons I've just given, but to see if the Christians in the different parties could come together and could form a common agenda, which we would then all fight for within our own parties, and we'd have this common Christian manifesto. Well, we came together, but we never got the common agenda. It was called the Movement for Christian Democracy, which still does exist, but we couldn't agree. Because it wasn't a question of the end. Pretty well everybody agrees on the end. It was a question of the means by which you get to the end. Now take one simple biblical text. Let you who have 2 coats give unto him that hath none. Now, a conservative will take that as being primarily, but certainly not exclusively, primarily an injunction towards individual responsibility. It is not enough to say you've paid your taxes and to ring up social services. You do actually alleviate need, if you can, where you see it. A socialist, and I do stress a socialist, not New Labour, I don't quite know how they interpret it, but a socialist, a real socialist, will interpret that as saying, right, that is an injunction to the state to confiscate the second coat through taxation, tear it up and redistribute it. Now, I exaggerate slightly, but in order to make a point, which is this, if you can take one tiny little piece of one verse of scripture like that and get radically different and fiercely held views on the best way to discharge the commandment that's contained there, then how much more does that apply to the whole panoply of Christian teaching? And of course you will have differences. And it is those differences which inform your choice of political party. I've always been a conservative because I believe that the Good Samaritan was a small businessman. You think how he was travelling. He had a beast. Now, a beast is what the authorised version calls it. We don't know if it was a camel or if it was a mule, but he was certainly travelling with a beast. Well, that's the equivalent of a rather good car today. You know, when people say to me, I should give up my car and go everywhere by pedal cycle, I say, I can't tell the man who fell among thieves. I can't take him to hospital in a pedal cycle. I need my car. He had a beast, which he was able to put at the disposal of the man who fell among thieves. And what a mighty well-equipped beast it was. Oil, wine, bandages. Couldn't have done any of it if he hadn't been a successful small businessman. That's who he was. Anyway, that is what informs my choice. But other people will have differently informed choices that are different. And we all come together in the House of Commons, and yes, we do disagree strongly with each other, vote against each other, sometimes get quite het up with each other. As I mentioned just now, one of my earliest cooperations in the House was with David Alton. We were comrades in arms on many a moral crusade in the House of Commons, and we became quite close friends, despite being in different parties. So I'm godmother to one of his children. He was one of my sponsors when I was received into the Catholic Church. I go up and visit his family in Lancashire quite regularly, and everything goes okay until we talk politics. And then somehow it all falls apart. So it really is possible to be united in Christianity, but to be disagreeing on the main way of implementing it. And then people say, you shouldn't talk about religion at all in public life. It should be a private matter. It's not terribly decent to put it on display. Now, I have two answers to that, one Christian and one civic. The Christian answer is based upon, first of all, St. Paul saying, we believe and therefore speak. And more importantly, Christ saying, hide not your light under a bushel. Well, I've been accused of many things by my enemies, but never yet of hiding my light under a bushel. But there is also a very strong civic reason why you should put your faith on display, which is this: you're asking people to vote for you. And therefore they really are entitled to know what drives you, what motivates you, what you're likely to do in any range of a given circumstances. That's what they need to know. Otherwise, how can they make judgments? And therefore, on all my election literature, throughout, I have always put my stand on the free vote issues of the day. Never shilly-shallied, never tried to please everybody, always recognised that I'd end up offending an awful lot of people, and my majority just went steadily up the whole time. People actually don't mind being offended as long as they believe that you believe what you're saying. What they don't want is to hear you being frightfully nice to them and not believe a word of it. Of course, it's very nice if you can get the two together. But if you can't, they prefer the first to the second. So that actually there is a very strong duty of democracy. That if you have a faith, doesn't matter what the faith is, if you have a faith, you should declare it, if you are standing for public office. But of course, we've now gone well beyond saying to politicians, you shouldn't really put your faith on display. The irony is that quite rapidly, the only people who can put their faith on display are politicians and clergymen. And I wouldn't like to predict who will be denied first putting their faith on display out of those two. We're about the only two left. Because in all walks of life now, or perhaps not in all of them, that's an exaggeration, but in a growing number of walks of life now, you may not put your faith on display. You may not display a symbol of your faith, which could be as simple as a very small cross. Now, I'm a very strong believer that you should, as long as it does not directly interfere with what you're doing, be able to put your faith on display. And sure, I have questions about wearing the burqa for certain jobs, but not about wearing the burqa in the street. That's down to the individual. And I think France is wrong to say you can't wear a burqa in public. And I think British Airways is wrong to say you can wear a hijab, you can wear a Sikh friendship bangle, but you can't wear a cross. Let people wear, within reason and with discretion and with respect for the constraints of the job, let people use the symbols of their faith, because this is supposed to be and used to be a free country. But it goes further than that. You can't even now say to somebody, God bless you. What on earth is wrong with saying God bless you to somebody? Now, if somebody who is not of the Christian faith says to me that they will pray for me or that they will do something else or uses some expression of their faith which I wouldn't use, I'm not offended. I say thank you very much because I was properly brought up. And that actually is what we should do. We should say thank you. Because as far as they're concerned, they are doing something very precious for you. And if somebody says, God bless you, and you happen to be a rampant atheist, well, what harm's it done you? Because according to you, he's not there to bless you anyway, so what harm's it done you? Hasn't done you any harm at all. But nowadays, there's practically industry around being offended, and everybody apparently gets offended. And nowhere is this more obvious than among the authorities and Christianity. And regularly we're told, you mustn't actually say that, because if you do, you'll offend other faiths. Other faiths are not offended. The one glorious time of that was the Millennium celebrations. We were celebrating 2,000 years of Christianity, and if we weren't, I don't know what 2,000 years we were celebrating. Nobody ever explained this to me. But the government, which was the Blair government, decided that it would like to have the Millennium celebrations with no prayer. And the reason given was it would offend other faiths. Other faiths thought we'd gone mad. They thought we were absolutely balmy. They knew it was our celebration. They were very pleased to be invited, but they knew it was our celebration. They wouldn't deny their own big festivals. They wouldn't deny their own big celebrations. We wouldn't ask them to. And they didn't quite understand why we were asking ourselves to. And usually it is not at all that other faiths will be offended, for the simple reason other faiths understand faith. They understand what it means, and they understand the demands that it makes upon an individual. So they don't get offended. The people who get offended are actually the secularists, who get offended on other people's behalf. And of course, secularism and multiculturalism are now trotted out as the two reasons why Christians should not be overt about their faith. But I would say of the Christian faith, as I would say it about any other, that there is an enormous difference between respecting other people's faith and surrendering your own. And that is something that is taken for granted by other faiths. They understand that. We, for some reason, have gone down a rather peculiar route. You know, if you look at Hansard, for 30, 40 years ago, God gets mentioned occasionally. Today, you wouldn't do it. It would be regarded as odd. If you read the great debates of ethics, the embryology debate, before I even entered Parliament, Enoch Powell made a very, very long, serious and historic speech on the use of embryos. And he actually quoted religion as well as ethics. It wasn't regarded as odd. Nobody stood up and said the honourable member's out of order. Nobody stood up and said, but the rest of the nation may not share that view. It was understood that if that was your view, you could state it. And so I do think it's important that we recognise that it should be possible to be overt for the motivation that somebody feels. As I say, whatever that faith may be. And you will find faiths coming together in public life on exactly those sorts of issues, where they all have the same view. They may differ in the reason, but they have the same view. You will find faiths coming together to deliver purely secular initiatives, like, for example, the single regeneration budget, which I used to look after when I was in the employment department, and we would not make it available unless the local faith groups, the mainstream faith groups, were involved. If they weren't involved and the local community wasn't involved, and volunteers weren't involved, and the voluntary organisations weren't involved, we didn't want to know. We didn't just want to channel money downwards. We wanted to make sure that everybody had ownership of that, and the faith groups used to play a major part. And none of them stood there and saying, we're not really doing this because of our faith. They all said it's actually very important to our congregations, very important to them that we do this. So I don't think anybody should apologise for being overt. And nobody should apologise for walking out when they don't agree with somebody being overt. And that is... I suspect it was the use of the name Enoch Powell. But anyway, that is actually what, in the end, democracy is about. What you are driven by, you must be driven by. Wilberforce was hugely driven by faith when he abolished slavery. Well, he didn't abolish it single-handedly, but his big campaign to abolish slavery. And he quoted faith as the reason. And he used it in the House of Commons as the reason that slavery could not possibly be reconcilable with the will of God. Oliver Cromwell, whom I can't stand. I have no vandalistic instincts in me except when I pass Cromwell's statue. And I used to pass it every day outside the House of Commons, and I longed just to do that, but I never did. But Oliver Cromwell, whom, as I say, I profoundly disagree with, I regard him as a regicide and a miserable, snuffling Puritan who made everybody's life misery. But nevertheless, he was driven in his views overtly by faith. So I quote those two people because, yes, we're used to faith in the past driving faith, whether it was Catholics and Protestants burning each other at the stake or the sort of laws or whatever it might be. But those two people, one saw his faith as the basis for the sort of parliament that he wanted to see, and the other saw faith as the basis for social justice, and neither of them thought it at all odd to say so. Now, I think we've got a choice coming up. We either resist the trend that you can't actually say so, doesn't stop people disagreeing with you, but you should be able to say why you are doing something, and people can then make a judgment on whether that is valid or not. Or whether we go along with the view that somehow you must have a total separation of faith and state, not just church and state, but faith and state. And I think that we are going down the second route, slowly, but the pace is increasing, and I think we should resist it. And we should say, no, what drives people is a vital part and a healthy part of our public life, of our politics, of our civic institutions, of our authorities, whether they be local, national, or whatever. And that really it brings me to the end of what I'm saying, with an appeal. When somebody says something that is based on their faith, whatever that faith may be, try not to look embarrassed. I do not look embarrassed if somebody else quotes their faith back at me. I have had some wonderful moments. And there was one when I was doing a programme on Moses and the law. And the BBC thought it would be a great idea if we went along and stood outside the Inns of Court and saw how many lawyers could recite the Ten Commandments. So I thought, right. So I went along, I quite inadvertently, without realising what I was doing until 3 seconds too late, actually commenced interviewing a former Lord Chancellor. But then I asked one young man, I said, excuse me, we're doing a programme on the Ten Commandments. We're just seeing how many people know the Ten Commandments. And he said, and he meant it, I'm sorry, I can't help you, I'm Jewish. And I said to his retreating back, but so was Moses. I think on that occasion I was mildly embarrassed. There are occasions when you can save people and occasions when you can't. And when the cameras are rolling, it's entirely within the mercy of the editor whether they show it or not. And he didn't show that, but whether it will appear in outtakes for entertainment programmes, I've no idea. The only other time I had a serious embarrassment when I couldn't save anybody at all was secular, nothing whatever to do with faith. And it was while I was doing Strictly Come Dancing, and I won't embarrass them by saying which one it was, but a local radio station rang me up, and sadly it was live. And they said to me, where do you buy your underwear? I'm not answering that. Mind your own business. So what I said was, sarcastically, oh, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And I promise you, the interviewer said, I promised you, and it was live, I couldn't save her. She said, oh, that sounds posh, where's that? So occasionally you can't save people from themselves. Anyway, I'm now happy to take questions on anything you like.
Anne, in your opinion, is the EU, either by design or default, stripping the continent of Europe of its Christian heritage?
I think individual governments certainly are, and I don't think that the EU has helped with some of its human rights rulings. But I do not think there is a plan on the part of the EU to de-Christianise Europe. I don't think that is so at all. I think that is down to individual governments, and some, as we know, are still quite Christian and quite active. So I think no. The question you haven't asked me is... because somebody's going to later on, when we're past the first 3 or 4, is which way I would have voted had I been in Parliament on Monday. And I would have voted against a referendum for this reason. I actually want a referendum, and I actually want to come out. But I do not want to come out unless I know what I'm coming to. And nobody's telling us that. There has incredibly been no work done on what the alternative might be. And it seems to me the height of all irresponsibility that a parliament would vote to lead its people from something without knowing what they were taking them to. And actually the last example was Moses. He led his people out of Egypt. And it took 40 years to clean up the mess.
I don't know about you, but I find the human rights, I don't know what you want to call it, debate, issue, anybody that's in trouble or gets found guilty of something, it always goes back to, but that's my human rights.
Yeah.
And if an appeal fails, I'll take it to the highest court because it's my human rights. How does our Christianity fit in? I'm all for people being allowed to have rights, but not just willy-nilly.
Yeah. Like all good things, human rights can be abused. There are a lot of very good things that get abused. Our asylum system is a good thing, per se. When it's abused, it's not. Many things that are highly controversial are at root, if they are used rather than abused, they are good things. And human rights as a concept has been with us for a very long time. And our law is based upon a concept of the rights of the individual. And from Magna Carta onwards, it's been developing on that basis. But what we have got now is an abuse of human rights, an abuse of the law. And we did actually say that this would happen when the Blair government was incorporating the Act, and I was in the shadow home job at the time, and our line was simple. We said, we don't think this is a good idea. We think it will lead to a lot of nonsense and a lot of abuse, but the government has done it, and therefore we will give it a whirl, and we'll watch to see what happens. But if it does lead down the path that we think it's going to lead, then we will take ourselves out. And I do know that David Cameron is very actively wanting to do something with human rights abuses. So with the abuse of the Act, rather. So I share your view. It's gone too far because it is misused, not because the concept is wrong. And what we also said at the time was that if we did come out of the Human Rights Convention, then what we would do if we thought there was anything that convention provided which our law did not, then we would write that specifically into our law. We did actually make that promise, which I think is a sound approach.
When you were younger, did you always want to be a politician, or was it when you got older you wanted to be one?
That's a good question. The answer is I did want to be a politician when I was quite young. I first formed an ambition to go into politics when I was about 13 or 14, but for all the wrong reasons, because I was growing up in the post-war period. And even throughout the 50s, and indeed really right up to the mid-late 60s, the television dramas, the novels, the cinema films, even children's comics, everything was still very heavily based on war and war stories. And of course, the towering figure from the war was Winston Churchill. And I think at 13 or 14, I seriously thought that all politicians were like Winston Churchill. Now, of course, I say I wish. So I was interested then, but for the wrong reasons. By the time I was 20, I had a much clearer appreciation of what a politician does. And there were then two driving motives. The first would not be understood by an awful lot of 18-year-olds today, but it was to fight socialism. Now, when I was growing up, getting my first-time vote, and even, 20 years after that, when I was arriving in Parliament, the world was very sharply divided, as we tend to forget 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The world was very sharply divided into two great warring political ideologies, capitalism and communism. And there was a real struggle for the future of the globe based on political ideology. And in Western democracies, that struggle was mirrored in a contest, obviously not between capitalism and communism, but between capitalism and socialism. But it was real extreme socialism. And everybody knew which side they were on. It was not a struggle in which you could just sort of take a rather neutral view. Everybody knew which side they were on. People genuinely believed, and it was true, that it would make a difference to the country which party won the general election, that there would be radically different agendas depending on which party won. You try saying that today. And so there was this, everybody was engaged and interested and thought it mattered, and it was a time of huge political consciousness amongst the young. But the other motivation, and one which stayed with me when, as you delightfully put it, I got older. And older and older, until I'm now a pensioner. But it stayed with me. It stayed with me. It was to try and solve problems which look as if they've got no solution. Now, when I say that, a lot of you will immediately be thinking, oh, the Middle East, Northern Ireland, the pensions crisis. Yes, I do mean those things. But I also mean problems at a very, very individual level. My most memorable moment as a member of Parliament didn't actually come in any front bench capacity. I was a minister at the time. but I was acting solely as a constituency MP when I got one of my constituents out of jail in Morocco, by which I mean I got him released. I didn't spring him from jail in Morocco. But by the time his wife came to see me, that chap had been convicted, been sentenced, lost his appeal, and was facing 9 years in a Moroccan jail for a crime that not even the Moroccans really believed he'd committed. And I thought, what am I supposed to do about this? And I can't intervene in justice in this country, never mind in somebody else's. So I went through all the usual diplomatic routes through the embassy and all the rest of it, got me where I expected to get, which was nowhere. And so as the last throw of a dice that I was utterly convinced was irretrievably loaded against me, I went out to Rabat. And I saw the King's Counsellor, the Justice Minister, the Interior Minister, anybody I could think of. Didn't think any of it was going to do any good, but I went and I did it anyway. And to cut a long story short, a moment came when I was able to phone up his wife and say, John's out, he's with the ambassador, he'll be home in 48 hours. And her reaction when she finally took in what I was saying told me why it was that I'd become a member of Parliament. And the sad thing is that on both sides of the House of Commons and in every political party, the overwhelming majority of MPs can point to one or more such moments when, because they were where they were and did what they did, however quirky it might have seemed to others, and most people thought I was mad to be going out to Rabat, however odd it seemed to others, they did it. And they didn't make a drop of difference to the nation, and they did not make a trickle of difference to their constituency, but they made a tidal wave of difference to an individual family. And yet most people think we're in it because we're sleazy, we're in it for ourselves, we're lazy, we're corrupt, and we're just about every other epithet that you can think of. And yet I tell you, most MPs are there because they want to make a difference. And sometimes it's at an individual level that you make it. Now, I don't know, young lady, if you're thinking about going into politics because you asked me that. If you are, let me give you one word of advice, and the same to any other young person in the room who might be thinking about it. Sure. But if you want to go into politics, first go away and do something else. Get real experience and preferably a record of success in the outside world, but at any rate, real experience. And bring that into Parliament, because that enriches Parliament in a way that a career politician, does not bring that same thing to Parliament.
I just want to say I really enjoy your speech, but I have to say that I disagree. I disagree with the idea of faith and politics being in the same realm. And my question to you, if every politician with a certain faith is allowed to exercise that into politics or into their job, how do you make sure that, how do you reconcile that, or is politics is only open to a certain religions?
No, I don't think politics is only open to certain religions. What I'm saying, and obviously it isn't, because we have a wide mix in the House of Commons. But obviously there will be some religions that do themselves forbid participation. Now, when we were doing some of the big bills, which I've already mentioned, the bills that David Moulton and I were doing, and there were a wide range of them over the time, everything from Sunday trading to abortion to adoption to all manner of things. And there were some members of the Plymouth Brethren. And whenever we were debating these big issues, one of us would look up and say, oh, brethren are there. Now, they used to go up into the gallery and pray. They couldn't enter politics. They couldn't even have a cup of tea with us afterwards, because they don't actually eat with unbelievers, as they regard us. And so they couldn't socialise with us. They would sit down with us, and they could have a glass of water. And so we all used to sit round with an exciting glass of water. That was it. They wouldn't participate. The Jehovah's Witnesses do not participate. That is their decision. And where a religion forbids that sort of participation, that's their business. It's not my business. That's their business. But where a religion allows participation, and where somebody is both a believer and an aspiring politician, then I think that that is extremely healthy, and it should be something that we all know about. And once you say that you mustn't mix politics and religion, all you get is the covert mixing of the same. And I'd much rather have it overt, because I like to know what motivates people. And as I said before, the comments I made apply very largely to every faith. I've just mentioned a couple of exceptions. But they apply largely to every faith. And I do feel very, very strongly you can't write God out of what you're doing. You can't put him in a box and say, well, he comes out on Sunday. Doesn't work like that. But we'll disagree, and that's our privilege.
I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but something that you've chosen the people to ask the question, something following on from that is, you yourself mentioned that you changed your faith. You later on took on Catholicism.
Well, I changed my denomination.
Well, I'm corrected your denomination.
Yeah.
How does this relate also to Tony Blair, that took us into Iraq, then also changed, in your words, his denomination?
Yeah. I never comment on anybody else's religious decisions or announcements. If somebody says they're a Christian, it is not for me to judge otherwise. That is a matter between them and Almighty God. I found one thing very puzzling about the Blair conversion, which is this. As well I know, at the point where you are received into the Roman Catholic Church, you have to make out loud and individually, it's not something you can murmur and hope you won't be heard, out loud and individually, you have to say these words: I believe all the church teaches to be revealed truth. And if you cannot say those words, you commit a fairly significant act of perjury at the point of reception. Now, I do not find it easy to reconcile, and I take out Iraq because Iraq is a rather different matter, but I do not find it easy to reconcile some of the votes that Blair made in the House of Commons with the teachings of the Catholic Church. And I go no further than that, because I do not know whether he changed his mind, okay, whether he got out of saying what everybody else has to say, or whatever. I don't even speculate on the third possibility, which is that he said it and didn't mean it, because he'd never do that in a million years. I don't know. I find that curious. It does exercise me a bit, but I absolutely refuse, even in those circumstances, to pass a definitive judgment, because actually it's not my place, it's the deity's place. He's rather better at it than I am.
Hi, I really enjoyed your speech, Anne. What I'm really interested in is, as a Christian in politics in the Conservative Party, how did you reconcile the fact that the rich carried on getting richer, the poor to a lesser extent, and the idea that you said if you have two coats, give one to the poor, but that doesn't happen. The debts could be wiped out if the people that earn way, way above the average would just pay their fair share of tax, instead of taking away the disability allowances and the care allowances for the lowest in society who can't afford those losses. Why not just tax the rich a bit more, or at least disallow them taking on accountants to hide all their funds?
Right. Do not tax the rich a bit more, folks. And do not think that you are adding to the common good, let alone the common wealth, by simply taxing the rich. Now, let me take a very, very specific example. The point of taxation is to actually raise money for the exchequer. It's not to reduce money for the exchequer, it's to raise money for the exchequer that you may actually discharge the responsibilities that you wish to discharge. Having a health service, a universal education service, a pension system, social services, whatever it might be, you need the money coming into the exchequer. Now, when the Thatcher government reduced the top rate of tax from 60% to to 40%, the net result was not a drop. It was a rise in the taxes taken from that income group. Why? You mentioned one of the reasons. Wasn't actually worth it anymore employing accountants to devise convoluted tax avoidance schemes. It wasn't actually worth designing convoluted offshore facilities. And it was worth, and above all it was worth, taking a risk at the margin, because it might actually pay. Now, when you start taxing the rich punitively, just because they're doing well, you don't get in more of their money. They go offshore, they send the money offshore, they go elsewhere for the duration. Whatever it may be, they do not cough up more. And I know that when the tax rate went up to 50%, I started saying no to some work. Because I did the sums. You take out my agent's fee, you take out the exchequer, and what's left? No thanks. Can do without it, tar very much. And that is what higher earners can say, do without it. And so the Treasury gets 50% of nothing, which, as any school child could tell them, is nothing. It's silly. Don't go for this nonsense about soak the rich, get more social justice. You don't. You reduce the funds in the exchequer. Let me say something else to you. Beware, folks, of trying to penalise, however angry you may be, the banks too much. The city brings in every single year 55 billion in taxes. 55 billion. Now, we've already driven, as a result of our reaction to the banking crash, we've driven 1 in 4 hedge funds out of the country. And before you say good riddance, thanks, they've taken 5 billion of taxes with them that we can't get anymore, but some other country will. Now, you don't look after your poor by driving out the rich. You really don't. You look after your poor by encouraging enterprise, be it big or small, by encouraging people to get richer. And it is true that under both governments, the Conservative government and the Blair government, the gap between rich and poor grew, but it is also true that under both governments, both sections got better off. Indeed, you only have to think back, for those of us with those long memories, to what you would have encountered in the homes of the less well-off in the 1950s and 60s, and think what you see now. They are better off, but they won't be, as the communists found out, if you start penalising the rich. And you end up at the extreme with a country of Trabants and tenement blocks. At the extreme. But in the meantime, you do a lot of damage to the exchequer. Don't have anything to do with the politics of envy. Don't touch it. Don't touch the politics of envy. It wrecks it for all of us.
I was interested in your description of politics being the incremental approach to long-term goals.
It is.
Would you see that the long-term goal behind the current health bill is the destruction of the NHS as we've known it?
No, I don't see that, but I do see this. I see it as a major step in a recognition that what we've got can't last. At the moment, you've got a 3-tier NHS, and have had for some time. It's nothing new about it. It's not a Labour invention. Been around for a long time. As an inevitable result of everybody trying to pretend, be they Labour or Conservatives, all governments have done this, that somehow the NHS can meet every last demand that is made upon it. It cannot. And so now we've got 3 tiers. And on the very top tier, you've got the people who get their NHS treatment very, very satisfactorily, or who choose, for whatever reason seem good to them, to go private. On the second tier down, you've got the people who don't get their NHS treatment. Maybe because of postcode lotteries, maybe because the procedure just isn't available in that area, maybe there's too long a list, whatever it might be, they don't get their NHS treatment. And they do not choose to go private, but they can. They can get themselves out of the trap, however reluctantly. But God help us, and I mean that reverently, on the third tier, you've got the people who don't get their NHS treatment. And if they starve themselves for a month, they still couldn't afford to go private. They're the very people for whom the NHS was set up in the first place, and they are totally dispossessed. You know, if before the NHS finally decided, or NICE, which actually is very nasty, I assure you, finally decided that Lucentis could be provided, you could see if you could afford it. And, you know, somebody stood up in one of my meetings and she said, Miss Widdecombe, aren't you embarrassed? I didn't see why I should have been. It was the Blair government, but anyway. She said, aren't you embarrassed that the only reason I can see you is because I can afford to? And I said, yes, I am actually. Now, we have a choice. We can bury our heads in the sand. We can repel every reform of the NHS. We can believe that there is some magic solution and that there is some unending pot of gold. Or we can face it and try incrementally to reform the system. Now, the reason I'm in favour of the present reforms is this. They are actually based upon a concept that's worked well. When we introduced GP fund holding back in the Thatcher years, GPs on the whole didn't want it. They're very conservative bodies, GPs. They didn't want it. But it sold itself very quickly, so that by the time we left office, 60% of GPs were either fund holding or had outstanding applications to become so. And the reason it sold itself was this. GPs were in the driving seat and could actually do things on behalf of their patients. So instead of being told by a regional health authority, this is the hospital you have to use, they could say, no, actually, we won't use that hospital because it operates on block appointments. Do you remember block appointments? I'm sure some of you do. You could sit in a hospital, by design, not accident, from 9 in the morning until 1 o'clock because they were block appointments. GP said, no, we're going to go for the hospitals which offer individual appointments. They could say, no, we're not going with that surgeon. He's got a habit of rather drastic remedies. We prefer this one. Seriously, could do. And it actually improved healthcare for patients. And gradually, GPs who'd been very suspicious and very wary said, yeah, we like this. Now, Labour had always promised, and I think if we hadn't had, I mean this, we hadn't had Frank Dobson in the health job, I think if we'd had Alan Milburn right from the start, don't think we'd have abolished fund holding. But Labour came in with a promise to abolish it, and ideologically, and for no other reason, because they were briefed that it was actually working very well, and the medical profession briefed them to that extent, they ditched it. They then, some years later, rather than admit they were wrong, reintroduced the scheme, but they called it GP commissioning. We said, yeah, thanks. Okay, we were right after all. Now, this set of reforms is based on an expansion of GP power. And I actually think it's right because it's been tried, it's been tested, we know it works on behalf of patients. So I do approve of the reforms, and I do say this. Every time there's a proposal to reform the NHS, there is a knee-jerk reaction. Big time. Everybody knows that. Any politician who decides to take on reform of the NHS is actually showing a lot of guts, I promise you, because there's always a big knee-jerk reaction. And I used to have scores of constituents in my surgeries telling me, you mustn't do it, when we were doing the Thatcher reforms. Same constituent sometime later saying, yeah, okay, thank you. Getting better service now. So, don't have a knee-jerk reaction. Be open-minded and accept the fact that what we have will not take us through the next 50 years. It really won't. We've got to change.
The question I wanted to ask has been partly explained by yourself and others during the meeting, but it's one that's troubled me for many years, and perhaps you too. Given the essential elements of Christian faith, faith, hope and charity on which we base, wouldn't it on the whole, morally and obviously, better to take a left-wing stance in politics, in the political scene, rather than a right-wing position, which tends to be based on capitalism, and that itself is based upon self-interest in a very marked way? Is it possible, then, for you to consider that be turning socialist tomorrow?
Nope. I am utterly convinced and utterly unapologetic capitalist. Let me just go back to the parable of the Good Samaritan, which I touched on in the course of my address. And I said to you he was almost certainly a small businessman. He was certainly successful. Now, he was only able to help the man who fell among thieves because he was travelling so well equipped, but then he went further. If you remember, he took him to an inn and he paid the innkeeper. And actually, as an aside, one of the great unrecognised lessons of that parable is trust. Because the Good Samaritan had to trust the innkeeper not to cheat him and just turn the man out. And the innkeeper had to trust the Good Samaritan to pay up when he next came. But anyway, I digress on that one. The essential thing from the point of view of this question is he paid the innkeeper. Who pays the innkeeper? Now, if you want to look after your citizens, you've got to have the means to do it. And if you don't have the means to do it, you can't. And therefore I say, and I have rather a good sermon, though I say it myself, which I very frequently give in city churches, and it's called God Bless the Moneymakers. And I do believe it. I do believe that if we're to have all the systems that we want and we've got to pay for them, we've got to allow people to make the money and pay us the taxes on the basis of the money that they make. So I really do believe in capitalism. Occasionally, it will go wrong. It has gone wrong recently. It went wrong with the Wall Street crash. It went wrong with the stock exchange crash in the 90s. It does occasionally happen. But I observe this, that in all the years when it's going swimmingly, and Britain is benefiting from huge amounts of money that's coming in via the city. We're one of the biggest financial centres in the world. And we take it for granted somehow that all these big financial institutions want to be in the City of London. Try regulating them out of it. But they want to be in the City of London. And we take their money, and we take their success, and we live off it. And we're very, very happy and contented and taking it for granted. And when it goes wrong, we go mad. But the good that it does, the mammoth good that it does in enabling us to have all these systems that we want, is incalculable. And I will never, ever be a socialist, because I do, surprise, surprise, because I do believe with every fibre of my being in the right of people to be unequal. We are equal in the sight of God. We should have equal opportunities. But of opportunities, people will make what they will. And some will make more than others, and they should be allowed to without being resented. And we should all give thanks, because the tall grass benefits the short grass. So no, I ain't going to be no socialist, and I'll take you on any day. Right.
Politics. I find it very frustrating when I watch on the television a TV interviewer interviewing a teenager and asking him really quite an obvious question, and they go, don't know. And anything to do with election time, and this isn't it's a generalisation, I'm not just picking on specific people.
Enough.
But quite often, if an older person is asked, who are you going to vote for? The answer will be, whoever's going to give me the most money to look after my heating costs. I, myself, would prefer it if young people were made to study politics as with English and maths, so as they grow up with it and they are interested and they are mindful of what's going on, because it is their country and they have to live in it in the end. And they will, when they get their right to vote, be able to make an informed decision. Any ideas?
Several. The first is to say this, and to refer back to something I said earlier, that when the young lady asked me when I decided to go into politics, I referred to an atmosphere at the time, a political atmosphere, that was very, very engaging of people's interests. And you wouldn't have met many young people then, you'll always meet some, but you wouldn't have met many young people then who would have either said, I don't know, either in terms of meaning what choice they were going to make, or in terms of meaning what the parties had to offer. You know, even if it was at its very, very simplest, this one grammar schools, that one comprehensive, you know, even if it was down to that sort of basic, they understood the basic division. Now, nobody taught them. We weren't taught politics at school, but there was such a division out there that people were interested, choices were being offered. People only respond democratically when you're offering them a choice. If they can't perceive a choice, they will shrug, and they will not know, and they will decide on the basis either of selfish or rather silly motives. So really, it is up to politicians to offer choice, and I don't mean the spectacular divisions of yesteryear, but I do think we ought to offer very, very distinctive choices so that people, just in 2 or 3 things, no more than that, so that people have something to engage with, if you like. At the moment, to most young people, it's an amorphous mass out there. And, I mean, it is a brutal fact that more people vote in reality shows, I'm very pleased to say, more people vote in reality shows. You know, I'd have loved to have had those numbers voting for me when I was a politician. They vote in reality shows than vote in things like local elections.
Earlier on, you referred to communism as being a very extreme form of socialism.
Yes.
So, in that respect, would that not make capitalism a very extreme form of conservatism, and therefore, as a political extremist, how, as a religious Christian, can you in any way reconcile, in the spirit of camels and needle eyes, the Jesus's mistrust, you bring the word trust into it, of the money men and the money makers? How can you reconcile that with what's going on in the city at the moment? And not in terms of envy of the rich, because that's not what it comes down to. It's in terms of restricting the very, very top people up there, and how, if Jesus could not trust these people to enter the kingdom of the Lord, then how can you reconcile working with them and allowing them to bleed the world dry to the tune of trillions as opposed to the 5 billion a year they supposedly bring in?
Well, first of all, nobody sits there in the banking industry or in any other sector of the city and says, I'm going to bleed the world dry, and by the way, I'm going to bring about a crash. Something went wrong. But until it went wrong, even if they were taking home huge bonuses, and even if they were doing very well for themselves, that's between them and God what they do with their money. And beware, because some very big philanthropists have very big money. That's why they are very big philanthropists. That's a matter between them and God. But I'm not saying there isn't a case for some regulation, because I think there is. I'm not saying there aren't lessons to be learned, because every time something goes wrong, there is usually, not every, but usually, there is a lesson or more to be learned. But what I am saying is there is nothing inherently wrong with making money, and I do not believe that capitalism per se is an extreme form of anything. Of course, you can have conscienceless capitalism, but that doesn't mean that all capitalism is that, or that it needs to be, or that it aspires to be. And enlightened capitalism, I have to say, no substitute has ever been found for it, either throughout history or across the globe, and lasted. Communism was, in Richard Crossman's rather wonderful words, the god that failed.
This may be a bit selfish, but this question that I'm about to ask is directly to do with my dissertation. So if you could provide a beautiful quote, get me a first, I'd really appreciate it. The issue of faith schools is something that academics and public media discuss quite a lot at the moment. Do you think that faith schools provide a good way of life, both academically and socially, for young people?
I do believe very strongly in faith schools for this reason. I think that if you have a faith, and I'm going to address the obvious question in a minute of fundamentalism and alienating people. But if you have a faith, it's entirely reasonable that you want your child to be taught the same thing both at home and school. One of the most difficult things for Christian and other parents is when the children go to school and are taught something that directly contradicts them, or are told they mustn't actually talk about their faith because it's wrong. So I do very strongly believe in faith schools. I do think that when you are running a faith school, you must always be cognizant of the fact that you are a part of and not something apart from the society in which you're bringing those children up. And therefore I think it is important that the inspection does determine that you don't have, under the cover of faith schools, children being taught to feel alienated from the society in which they're growing up. It's okay to be told you're different. It's okay to be told you believe something that the overwhelming majority don't. You can be told that. But don't feel alienated and feel aggressive towards the society in which you're growing up. Right, okay. I want to know, is either of your question a frivolous one? Mine is. Right, let's have it.
Have you still got all those lovely Strictly dresses? Oh.
This time I did hear correctly. And when people ask me if I kept my Strictly dresses, the first thing I say is, who would want to? But there was one dress which I did want to use again. And what happens to the Strictly dresses? No, we don't keep them. They're actually sold in the United States. And, yeah. Oh, it gets worse. Don't worry, it gets worse. And when I was asked to do the Strictly tour, you know, that's the live tour, so I can now truthfully say I've played Wembley. When I was asked to do the live tour, I thought, right, I'm going to see if Wardrobe can lend me Big Bird. Now, Big Bird is the nickname I gave to a dress that was bright yellow and plastered in feathers. Some of you may remember it. I thought, if I wear that in those huge venues like the O2 and Wembley, they can see me. I'll get Big Bird. So I rang up Wardrobe and I said, could I please borrow Big Bird for the tour? And they said, oh, we're terribly sorry, it's already been sold in the States. So somewhere, some American is going around. And the mind just boggles. I will just tell you one thing about Strictly, which is this, because everybody comes up to me and says, thank you very much for the entertainment. They never say thank you for the dancing. But in the first 2 hours of the first day's training on Strictly, Anton said to me, I think the less time you spend with your feet on the floor, the better. So he devised flying, lifting, dragging, spinning, precious moments when I stood still and he danced round me. Anyway, we were in week 10 of a 12-week competition. And up to that stage, we hadn't once been in the bottom 2. And I said to him, Anton, what are we going to do if we get into the final? And he said, it's okay, I've already got it worked out. He said he was going to fly in from one end of the studio. I was going to fly in from the other end. We were going to meet under the glitter ball. And we were going to dance in the air.